was crowned in gold but ruled in glass. Charles VI, King of France, believed his bones were fragile, his skin could shatter, and his throne, already cracking under the weight of a broken kingdom, was safer than the world outside. He screamed when touched, wore iron-stitched garments to protect his limbs, and sat for hours, paralyzed by the thought that any movement might destroy him. But this was not a brief episode. This was the mind of France's ruler for over 4 decades. The horror wasn't that Charles went mad, it was that no one could or would stop him. His family locked him inside gilded chambers. His court tore itself apart trying to control the corpse of his authority. And outside the walls, France began to rot, bled by civil war, humiliated by foreign powers, and slowly handed over to its enemies, all while the king muttered to himself in shadows, convinced the heir could kill him. Some kings fall to ambition, some to betrayal. Charles fell to nothing but his own mind. But his story doesn't begin with madness. It begins with a child born to reign, groomed in the rituals of power, and infected early by the weight of inheritance. Even before the voices whispered, before the hallucinations clawed through the veil, France was already nursing a curse, and the boy was already starting to break. They didn't crown a boy, they crowned a burden. Charles was just 11 when the crown of France dropped onto his head like a shackle. His father, Charles the Wise, one of the most learned kings of medieval Europe, had left behind a fragile peace, a treasury on the brink, and a throne surrounded by wolves. The 100 Years' War had already scarred France to the bone, but the real rot was internal. From the start, Charles's reign was not shaped by his own will, but by the hands that gripped the edges of his mind. 4 powerful uncles took control of the regency. They weren't caretakers, they were predators. Each claimed to serve the boy, but what they served was themselves. They siphoned the treasury, plunged the country back into debt, and fought each other behind velvet curtains while Charles stood smiling in parades, unaware that his crown had already been sold piece by piece. His childhood was not innocence, it was conditioning. He was groomed to obey, to carry the myth of kingship like a golden mask, while the machinery of power turned in blood-stained shadows. The court around him was a place of velvet lies and whispered panic. Servants bowed low but spoke of omens. Advisors nodded but watched him too long. And somewhere in the boy's bones, a question began to take root. What if I'm not whole? Even before the first public breakdown, Charles had already shown signs. Long silences, sudden tremors, blank stares in the middle of court ceremonies. They called it fatigue. They called it pressure. They never called it by its name, a fracture. The weight wasn't just on his shoulders, it was in his blood. His mother, Joanna of Bourbon, had herself suffered bouts of insanity. And the Bourbon line carried whispers of something darker than politics, an inherited curse passed not through swords or crowns, but through the quiet unraveling of the mind. Charles was never trained to fight it. He was taught to hide it, to dress it in ermine robes and speak through ceremony. But madness does not care for crowns, it waits. And when the king believes he is safe, it slips through the cracks. By the time Charles reached 20, France was no longer ruled by regents. The boy had come of age, but he wasn't alone at the throne. Something else had come with him, something he couldn't name, only feel. And when it finally surfaced, it didn't knock, it slashed. And the first blood spilled wasn't on the battlefield, It was inside his own tent. Madness didn't arrive as a scream. It arrived as steel drawn in the sun. In the summer of 1392, Charles, now a king in name and form, marched with his army toward Brittany. The campaign was meant to punish an assassin, but what followed punished France far more. As they crossed a forest near Le Mans, a barefoot man in rags burst from the trees, grabbed the king's horse, and shouted, "Do not go forward, noble king. You are betrayed." The guards dragged him away, but something broke. Charles went silent. His hands twitched at the reins. For hours afterward, he rode under the sun in absolute stillness. Then, without warning, he turned on his own escort, drew his sword, and butchered 4 men, screaming incoherently, eyes wide with a terror no one could understand. He was tackled, disarmed, and dragged off his horse. He collapsed. Then he forgot who he was. The soldiers didn't call it madness. They said it was heat, or sorcery, or poison. But when Charles woke, he didn't recognize his wife. He didn't remember being king. He stared through people like they weren't real. For days, he drifted in and out of himself, sometimes lucid, sometimes mumbling, often convinced he was surrounded by enemies. France had no name for what was happening. There were no doctors, no language for the mind breaking from within, and yet the horror was clear. The king had vanished, but his body remained. The court closed ranks. His brother, Louis of Orleans, stepped in with eager hands. The dukes returned to Paris, whispering regency. And Charles, still pale, still trembling, sat behind closed doors as if he had died without a funeral. But this wasn't a single fit. It was the beginning of a pattern. The attacks came and went like curses. Days, weeks, sometimes months, he would appear normal, laughing, ruling, even dancing. Then it would strike again, and each time it came back, it carved deeper into him. The people began to call him Le Folle, the mad, but it wasn't just Charles who was unraveling. Behind the walls of the Louvre, factions sharpened blades. His wife, Isabeau, his brother, the Duke of Burgundy, all smiling, all plotting. Because now the throne of France wasn't just a seat of power, it was a corpse to be puppeted. And while they fought to control the crown, something else grew beneath it. Not just mental collapse, but delusion, paranoia, hallucination. Charles began to feel it crawling under his skin, and soon it would take a shape no king had ever dared confess aloud. The king would no longer fear death, he would fear being touched. It started with silence, then came the whispers, then the glass. Charles began speaking of fragile bones, not metaphor, not poetry. He believed truly, wholly, that his body was made of glass, not his mind, his flesh. That one wrong move could shatter him into 1,000 jagged pieces. He ordered steel rods sewn into his clothing to prevent his limbs from breaking. He refused to be touched, even by his own children. And sometimes, for hours, he stood perfectly still, afraid the wind might destroy him. This was no madness of rage or violence. It was worse. It was a madness of illusion so total that it rewrote reality itself. Charles didn't merely believe he was fragile, he lived it, ate in fear, slept in fear, walked like a man tiptoeing through the wreckage of his own mind. His courtiers obeyed, pretending nothing was wrong. They bowed, whispered, and moved softly. But behind every polished column of the palace they watched and waited. This was not a private breakdown. This was a kingdom held hostage by delusion, And yet France had no king to replace him. His heir was too young. His wife had no power of her own. His uncles, each hungrier than the last, began carving up the country behind a curtain of ceremony. They let Charles rot in his belief, because as long as he stayed broken, the game remained open. But here's the twist no one expected. Charles didn't just suffer, he sometimes came back. Days, even weeks, of lucidity would return without warning. He would ride, speak of law, hold court like a sovereign. Then, like a switch thrown by a hand no one could see, he would snap. Blank stare, shaking hands, rambling about glass. The terror wasn't knowing he was mad. The terror was never knowing when France began to mimic its king, fragile, suspended. Cracking, by the dawn of the new century, the cracks had spread far beyond Charles's body. They were in the court, in the treasury, in the veins of power. And the woman closest to the throne, his queen, was about to become more than a wife. She would become his jailer, his replacement, his enemy. And as the crown dulled, another crown in silence began to rise. A kingdom cannot kneel to glass forever, so they crowned the next best thing, his wife. Isabeau of Bavaria was no stranger to whispers. Foreign-born, ambitious, and too poised for a court that fed on weakness, she stepped forward not as a grieving consort, but as a woman prepared to rule. Charles, when lucid, still called her queen, but when the fog descended, when he forgot her name or screamed at her touch, Isabeau became something else entirely. She became his voice, his proxy, and eventually his cage. At first it was necessity. Someone had to sign. Someone had to speak to foreign envoys, approve royal decrees, command the palace guards. But power, once tasted, rarely softens. Isabeau did more than govern. She maneuvered. She built her own network inside the court. Servants, scribes, bishops, and spies loyal to her, not to the crown. The king's body still sat on the throne, but it was no longer his. Behind closed doors, Charles withered. The lucid moments grew rarer. His speech slurred. He wandered halls barefoot at night, muttering of invisible assassins. At times, he didn't recognize his own reflection. The man once called the beloved had become a haunting, a reminder that the mind is the most dangerous battlefield of all. And through it all, Isabeau did not break. She held court, bore 12 children, and brokered peace, while France groaned under debt and division. But no act went unnoticed. Her closeness with the Duke of Orleans, Charles's younger brother, began to stir rumors. Too many glances, too many closed meetings, too many decisions signed by two names. The whispers multiplied. Was the Queen still ruling for the king or replacing him? Power had not vanished. It had only moved, from the crown to the pillow, from the throne to the bedchamber. And as factions sharpened their daggers in the dark, one thing became clear. Charles was no longer a man, he was a mask. And Isabeau, whether savior or usurper, was the hand beneath it. But France would not be ruled by shadows for long. Blood was coming. Brothers would turn on brothers. And the king's madness would become a weapon, not wielded by him, but in his name. The king was still breathing, but France had already split. With Charles drifting deeper into his delusions, the throne turned into a battlefield of proxies. Two names emerged from the fog, not as rivals, but as reflections of the same ambition. Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother and rumored lover of the queen, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, blood-soaked tactician, and heir to the most powerful duchy in the realm. They both claimed loyalty. They both kissed the ring. But neither served the king, they served the hollow he left behind. At court, civility reigned. In the streets of Paris, it bled. Supporters of each duke clashed under banners of loyalty, but it wasn't loyalty they were dying for, it was control over a throne without a mind. Isabeau backed Orleans, the university elites, the Paris mob, and the merchants backed Burgundy. It began as rivalry, it spiraled into war, and Charles, he watched none of it. Or if he did, he no longer understood what he was seeing. There were moments he would scream at mirrors, believing assassins had entered the room. Other times, he refused food for days, convinced it was poisoned by demons. Once he ran through the palace naked, claiming the walls were whispering treason. The king wasn't absent, he was there in full view, but he had become a living hallucination. Then, in 1407, Burgundy made his move. Louis of Orleans was hacked to death in the streets of Paris, his skull split open with an axe. Burgundy didn't deny it, he called it justice. The act shattered what little illusion remained. France was now in open civil war, a kingdom torn not by foreign swords, but by internal rot sharpened into blades. Each side rallied under a name. The Armagnacs, followers of the slain duke's son, and the Burgundians, now emboldened by blood. They kidnapped cities, they assassinated magistrates, they raised taxes, then burned the tax collectors, all in the name of a king who couldn't speak a coherent sentence. It was no longer Charles's crown they fought over. It was the void where his will used to be. And as France collapsed into factions, torn between loyalty, vengeance, and opportunism, one foreign power watched in silence, waiting for the moment to strike. And that moment was coming fast, wearing red, white, and lions. While France devoured itself from within, England sharpened its teeth. In 1415, Henry V, young, relentless, and born with a hunger for conquest, crossed the Channel with an army of hardened killers. He didn't come to negotiate, he came to reclaim what his ancestors had once claimed, the throne of France. And Charles VI, the rightful king, was in no condition to stop him. He didn't issue orders, he didn't raise armies. Some say he didn't even know a war had begun. The French nobles, fractured by years of infighting, tried to rally what they could. But the kingdom was not ready. Cities were half loyal, generals were half sober. Soldiers were underpaid and underfed. And Henry, he brought death with precision. In the mud of Agincourt, he slaughtered thousands of French knights, his archers tearing through plate armor like parchment. It wasn't just a defeat. It was humiliation, a mirror held up to a kingdom led by ghosts. The Burgundians refused to back the royal army. The Armagnacs blamed the queen. Isabeau, trapped between factions, found herself with no allies and no army. And Charles, still alive, still breathing, wandered the halls of his palace at night, talking to walls and windows, convinced he was surrounded by traitors made of smoke. Then came the betrayal no one saw coming. In 1418, Paris fell to the Burgundians. The Armagnac leaders were massacred. The streets of the capital turned red, and Isabeau vanished. She reappeared months later, not as a prisoner, but as a participant. She had switched sides. And in 1420, she stood beside her enemies and signed the unthinkable, the Treaty of Troyes. In the name of her mad husband, she gave away France. Her daughter would marry Henry V, and Henry would inherit the crown of France the moment Charles died. Not the Dauphin, not her son, a foreign king, an English lion. They dressed Charles in his royal robes for the occasion. He nodded, he smiled, he said nothing. He may not have even understood what he was giving away. France wasn't conquered by war, it was handed over by those inside the palace. The glass king didn't shatter from pressure. He was lifted like a puppet and used to sign his country's death warrant. But death wasn't done with the royal house. The English thought they had secured their future. They didn't know both kings were already dying, one slowly in the mind and the other silently in the blood. And when they fell, they would leave behind a throne with no master, and two nations ready to tear each other to pieces over it. They gave him robes, they gave him parchment, they gave him a pen. What they didn't give him was a choice. Charles VI was still King of France, but only in the way a painting hangs above a ruined altar. He no longer issued commands. He no longer recognized his sons. Most days, he couldn't even remember that a war existed, let alone that it was his signature that had handed France to her enemies. After the Treaty of Troyes, Charles became a symbol, not of power, but of surrender made flesh. Henry V now ruled in all but name. The English swept through northern France, planting banners not with brute force, but with a legal right. Every castle captured was not a conquest, it was an inheritance. And Paris, once the heart of French sovereignty, beat now to the rhythm of English boots and Burgundian gold. The Dauphin, Charles's legitimate heir, had been declared a bastard and exiled south. His own father, drifting between silence and screaming, had signed away his future. But this was not stability. This was a corpse propped up to keep the illusion alive. Charles lived in a palace that no longer belonged to him. He was moved from room to room by attendants who no longer looked him in the eye. On good days, he stared out the window, asking for his queen, who now belonged to another side. On bad days, he screamed that the walls were melting. Once, he tried to burn his own bed, believing it had turned against him. The court no longer feared his madness. They feared his existence. Because as long as Charles lived, the lie had to continue that France still had a king, that everything signed in his name was legitimate, that the nation hadn't already been sold piece by piece to pay for a war it could never win. And then fate, as if sickened by the charade, moved faster than anyone expected. In 1422, within months of each other, both kings began to die. Henry V, victorious, untouchable, heir to 2 crowns, collapsed from dysentery in the prime of his reign. Charles VI, already a husk, followed not long after, but neither man would close the story, because the next chapter belonged to their sons, and only one of them had a kingdom to claim. The other had only a crown's, and a war he had no memory of starting. They called it a royal passing, but it was closer to a disappearance. Charles VI died on October 21st, 1422, in the heart of a city that no longer served him, under the shadow of a crown that had long since been emptied. There was no grand farewell, no thunderous mourning, no unified court weeping for their king. France was fractured beyond grief. The man who once rode in golden armor through adoring crowds now died alone, shriveled in his own mind, surrounded by the faint scent of urine and incense. Some say he hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in months. Others say he whispered names no one recognized. His final years had become a slow horror, not of violence, but of absence. The kind of emptiness that gnaws from within until the soul forgets its own shape. Charles no longer recognized his crown. He mistook guards for ghosts. He spoke to walls, then feared they were listening back. Once he demanded every mirror in his chambers be smashed, convinced they were gateways for demons. The madness had won, but it hadn't killed him. It had left him alive just long enough to erase everything he once was. And when death finally came, it came gently. No scream, no collapse, just stillness. The kind of stillness that made the servants pause, not because a king had died, but because they weren't sure if he'd been alive at all. His body was buried in St. Denis beside kings who had ruled, conquered, and built empires. But Charles VI didn't leave behind an empire. He left behind a wound. France was not whole. The Treaty of Troyes still stood. The English still held Paris. The Burgundians still whispered their threats. His son had been disinherited. His wife had changed sides. The very dynasty he inherited, once feared across Europe, now clung to survival like a ghost in a ruined cathedral. And what came next would not be peace, it would be fire, from a disinherited prince, from a crown with no anchor, from a war that had already devoured half a century and now demanded blood from a new generation. Because Charles's death did not end the war, it passed it on. And the kingdom he left behind was not done breaking. A dead king is supposed to leave peace. Charles VI left a disease. When he died, the throne didn't stabilize, it staggered. His legitimate heir, the Dauphin Charles, was still alive, still defiant, and still declared a bastard by his own father's signature. Meanwhile, the English proclaimed their infant prince, Henry VI, grandson of Charles VI, as king of both England and France, a baby, wrapped in silk, crowned over a corpse. And behind that fragile crown, the old madness stirred again. The bloodline had not cleansed itself in death, it had simply shifted hosts. Charles's daughter had married Henry V, and in their son, the blood of madness and ambition mingled. French instability fused with English pressure. It would take years, but when the boy came of age, the signs appeared. Withdrawn, melancholic, then worse, sudden paranoia. Periods of speechless isolation. A court that began to whisper that the king was not fully present. It was happening again, the mind folding in, the throne becoming a ghost. But this time, it wouldn't just break a court. It would collapse an empire. Henry VI's descent would ignite the War of the Roses, a decades-long civil slaughter that tore England in half, all because a king couldn't carry the weight in his skull. This was Charles VI's true legacy, not the treaties, not the wars, not the chaos of his rule, but the inheritance of weakness. He passed down a crown cracked at the center, not just to France, but to England. He infected the very idea of monarchy with doubt, that a ruler might wear gold and still be hollow, that a nation might obey and still be lost. And even as France began to claw its way back under the sun he disowned, even as new banners rose, the shadow of Charles remained. He had shown Europe that a throne doesn't need a tyrant to fall. It only needs an empty face. But before his ghost could fade, something else, something unimaginable, was about to rise from the ashes. Not a king, not a prince, but a peasant girl who heard voices louder than the screams of war. France did not rise from strategy. It rose from desperation and a voice that sounded nothing like a king. In the years after Charles VI's death, the kingdom he left behind was less a country and more a corpse stitched together by banners. The English held the north. The Burgundians kept Paris. The Dauphin, now Charles VII, roamed the Loire Valley like a king without a crown, surrounded by skeptics, spies, and generals more loyal to survival than to any flag. And then she came, a teenage girl, illiterate, dirt on her hands, claimed she heard voices from heaven, claimed she was sent to save France. No lineage, no rank, no claim, just fire. And in that fire, France finally saw something stronger than Charles had ever given them: conviction. It wasn't supposed to be her, it was supposed to be him. Charles VI had been groomed to carry France's soul, to hold its sword. Instead, he crumbled, slowly, terrifyingly, and in full view. And now, a farm girl stood where kings had failed, lifting a banner that kings had dropped, and walking straight into the blood-soaked void that madness had carved. Joan of Arc was not a miracle. She was an answer to a vacuum. She didn't rise because France was strong. She rose because it had fallen so far that the only voice it could trust was a voice from the mud. Her victories burned away doubt. Her presence shamed the crown back to life. Even the Dauphin, shaky, unsure, half-believed by his own court, could not deny the force she carried. It was not about thrones anymore. It was about belief. And belief had been missing since the day Charles VI began whispering to his demons. This is the final horror of his reign, that a king, crowned in gold and robed in silk, collapsed so completely that the crown had to be resurrected by a child in rags. But not even fire can erase a curse, and what Charles left behind would echo long after the saints stopped speaking. Charles VI did not die in battle. He did not go out with poison or betrayal. He simply faded day by day until nothing remained but a hollow name on paper and the legacy of a kingdom broken from the inside out. But his death was not the end. It passed the sickness on. His grandson, Henry VI of England, would inherit the crown and the madness, and his descent would drown England in civil war, and the France he left behind. It would be lifted, not by kings, but by fire, by faith, by a teenage girl who claimed she spoke with God. Watch Joan of Arc, the peasant who became a saint and walked into war like no man dared. Witness Henry VI, the boy king who shattered a dynasty with silence. More stories like these live in the dark corridors of this channel. Subscribe if you're not afraid to follow the bloodline all the way down. We'll see you in the next fall.